Folks, I'd like just to take a moment to offer you something that I think might be helpful for you and for us as a church as we enter into the autumn and winter in the midst of this pandemic. A lot of people that I've been speaking to recently, particularly over the last really 2 or 3 weeks, in church, but also in family and friends, and also with other pastors around the country, and them sharing about themselves, but also about their congregations too. As well as, I think, something that we see across the media at the moment too. These people that I've been speaking to are telling me about how much harder life seems at the moment, especially in terms of feelings of loneliness and disconnection and isolation. Some of life feels normal-ish at the moment, some of life certainly isn't, and we found ourselves in a kind of new phase in the pandemic that it's perhaps a bit harder to deal with. And why is that? Well, part of the reason for that is because actually we as humans respond to emergency situations, disaster situations, crisis situations in a particular way. This isn't going to be the whole reason why we're feeling that, and for each of us there'll be different pressures, but I'd like to just tell you about what I think is a helpful model that comes from emergency relief and response, and the research that they've done into how people deal with emergency situations. There are 3 stages to this. The first stage is response. This is the initial reaction to an emergency, and it tends to be an adrenaline-fueled reaction that makes sure all the vital elements to preserve life are found. Food, water, shelter. So think back a few months to the shortages of some food products and loo roll and things like that. We are shocked by the emergency, but having the capacity to think long term, we just do what's necessary. This stage tends to last somewhere around 3 to 6 months, depending on the emergency. The second stage is recovery. This is the stage that we are now in or entering into. In this stage, the characteristics tend to be trauma, grief, anxiety, not really knowing what normal is and how we're to act. I think that we're seeing a lot of this now. The national press, in our governments, and in our own lives, and in the church. I think that the disconnection and the isolation that perhaps you're experiencing and a lot of people are feeling is part of this phase. It's a time where the adrenaline that got us through those early months has gone. A time where the messaging about what we're to do is more nuanced and therefore more difficult. We're also exhausted from responding so immediately to the crisis. So that everything now that was once much more simple is so much harder. Here is where we really begin to recognise also what we have lost, and we begin to grieve. This second phase, the phase that I think we are starting in now as a country, it lasts it's from 6 to kind of 18 months. Third stage is the rebuild. And in this stage, we face the reality of what has happened. We face up to the fact that resources are scarcer, and particularly finances. There'll be a new way of doing things, and some I think are that we have found and will be here to stay. Things like face masks, things like pre-booking, and limited numbers of people in gathered situations. Some things will come in that we can't even yet conceive of. This will change how we live our lives as the church, as Jesus' followers. Church will change. Our values will change too as a culture, and we need to recognise that whilst we aren't there yet, we're going to already begin to see some of these values changing. Health will become a greater priority, family has become a greater priority, our key workers have risen up in our national consciousness, and rightly so. For church, we will have to face the fact that these changes affect us. We won't have answers for a while yet for all of these things. And in this phase, this last rebuild phase, well, we're not there yet, so we can't really anticipate much about it. But do you know what we do know, as Jesus' followers? That Jesus Christ will continue to build his church. For Talkeon Church, we've sensed a call from God to seek his heart and to wait patiently for him. Very difficult to do in times of great change. But we must realise now that when we get to this third stage, how we live as followers of Jesus may well look quite different to how it looked before lockdown. This stage also tends to start to take place at about 18 months after the crisis and goes on for up to 3 years. So what we're looking at here is looking into 2022 and 2023. In reality, these stages are one way of understanding crisis situations and how they develop and how humans as a whole respond to them. And the stages are no way nice and neat, but they just might be helpful to just give a bit of insight into why a lot of us are feeling the way we're feeling at the moment. And of course, where emergency relief and response and the research they do around this is out of its depth, is that no one's really engaged in the kind of global pandemic that we are seeing at the moment. Everyone is new at this, from world leaders to health experts, down to you and I. We're probably now in that second phase, the recovery phase, but that doesn't mean that we're all out of the first phase, the response phase, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not experiencing these change of phases differently. I think it is helpful, though, to know that some of what we're experiencing is because we are human. This is what we should be experiencing. We're not alone in that experiencing. Across the country, across the world, and across the church too, this is where we are. We're feeling a mixture of anxiety and loneliness and isolation and uncertainty. It helps no one if we just ignore this. This is where we are. And we're going to be grieving. We're going to be grieving for some of us in terms of lost loved ones. For some of us, it'll be in terms of the big, significant birthday celebrations that got cancelled, or the holidays we were hoping for, or perhaps even saving up for a long time, that just aren't happening now. Significant family occasions that we've lost. Maybe now just it's simply the time we would have spent with friends and loved ones that we've missed. We have all lost a lot over the past 6 months. We shouldn't downplay it. Of course, we know Jesus, and we do know that somehow, though a mystery to us often, our God is in control. And so I offer you this model, but also say that Jesus being present here makes a difference. What difference? Well, we shouldn't expect God to take us out of this, or to somehow plaster over our wounds in a quick and miraculous manner. He might, he can, if he wants to. He can do what he wants. It's generally not his way, though. The way of Jesus tends to be the way of suffering. We're not exempt from the suffering in this world, the suffering in this life, just because we're Jesus followers. And we should lament, we should acknowledge before God and before each other that this is painful and this is hard. Perhaps we need to rediscover the preciousness of the book of Job or the book of Lamentations, the preciousness and the need for Psalms 10 and 13, and Psalm 88. In fact, the last Sunday that we had pre-lockdown, we looked at Psalm 88 together, and you might just want to go back on our website, pick that up again, give that a listen. We also need to remember that whilst Jesus doesn't tend to take us out of these situations, he does meet us in the middle of them. He's the good shepherd, Psalm 23 reminds us, who leads us through death's darkest valleys. And in the midst of suffering and in the middle of our enemies, he provides for us and promises that one day we will dwell with him in the house of the Lord forever. God orchestrates suffering in this world, in our lives, to strip us, really, his children, of any and all self-reliance. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9, after recounting his own suffering that led him and his companions to feel like they'd been sentenced to death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. So I offer you this model as a way of just maybe locating ourselves in the pandemic. And I remind you of the Good Shepherd who is present in the suffering. So now, no matter how you're feeling today or tomorrow or the next 6 months, God is present and he is utterly dependable.